Welcome to the GuestX podcast, where my co-host Brian Amaui and I uncover the latest technologies and human-driven initiatives that are raising customer expectations and forever changing how we define customer experience across a host of industries. If you're passionate about creating incredible content and unique experiences, join us as we talk to leading product and experience experts across the globe and learn how today's most successful brands are setting themselves apart from the competition. Welcome to the GuestX podcast. Today is going to be a good day with my co-host Brian Amaui. Brian, how you doing, bud?
Awesome. So excited for today's
I know.
discussion.
I was thinking about you. I'm like, Brian is like a kid waking up on Christmas morning today because we are talking about storytelling and the art of storytelling and its importance to your brain. I mean, like, there couldn't be anything in business that you get more excited about than like those words combined, storytelling and brand.
I know. It feels like, especially in our industry, Matt, like everything revolves around storytelling. And I don't know how many people really realize that that is truly the business that we're in, is just storytelling. Like, we are providing vacations and we're selling a story to people to come and have a vacation with us.
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, you could argue almost every business, right, is in the business of storytelling. But I certainly think, to your point, even more so in travel.
I agree, 100%.
Yeah.
100%.
And today's one of the best. So you go ahead, give an intro. But I mean, when it comes to storytelling, there may not be any better. Go ahead.
So today's guest is Dennis Ross. Dennis is a master of storytelling, beginning with its construction to its presentation. Dennis is the founder of Book Ambition, Inc., a first-of-its-kind company providing boutique ghostwriting services for books and corporate store design for ad agencies and entrepreneurs. Dennis's extensive work can be seen and heard when you're listening to best-selling authors like groups like Boyz II Men and many others. Dennis, welcome to the show.
Well, today I'm really excited. Dennis, thank you so much for joining us on the GuestX podcast, where I know Matt and I are really excited to have our listeners listen to you. But for the people that don't know you, haven't followed you on LinkedIn, which I'm going to encourage everybody to find Dennis after this recording, give us a little bit about your background, how you got started in the mastery of writing and being an author, and what you're up to now.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. Dennis Ross is my name. I'm the founder of bookambitition.com. And to speak about my background, about how I got started in the art of storytelling, it's quite curvaceous by nature. Professionally, I started in the music industry. I started in entertainment. Over 27, 28 years ago, I was a producer, songwriter for a little known group called Boyz II Men.
Yeah, just a little. Just much of my high school right there, I will tell you. Okay.
Just an underground group, in Philadelphia, but no, obviously they're
I have a million stories about that as well. Me and my friends singing Boyz II Men. Here we go.
Yeah. So I started off with them professionally as a writer, but even prior to that, I always knew I had the gift, the God-given gift. I won't take credit for it, for storytelling and for writing, even as a child. And you say, well, how do you know that as a child? I was 8 years old. My father was pastoring a church in Greensboro, North Carolina, across the street from A&T University. And the church was singing songs, as we usually do, hymns and whatnot. And I was in a little group, myself and two other 8-year-olds. And so, just a regular church existence. And one day I went home and I said to myself, yes, why are we singing other people's songs? And I actually went back to church the next day with an original song for us to sing. And in my mind, that planted the seed for, number one, creating original content, having your own story, not just singing or saying someone else's. And that was the germ, really, for the creation of content such that everyone else would want to participate. And that may seem a little wild, but literally at the age of 8 is when I first realized I wanted to create my own story. And so when you fast forward into the professional industry, I was a songwriter, producer, worked with everybody. As I said, I was signed to Boyz II Men. They moved me to Philadelphia. I had a chance to pretty much work with everyone after that, produced Vanessa Williams, worked with Sony, and was signed to Warner Brothers. Essentially, when my contract was up with Boyz II Men, moved to Los Angeles, was sort of a free agent, produced everyone at that point, worked with Jermaine Jackson, produced him and Michael before Michael passed. So I did a lot in the music industry, went back to school, left the music industry. I'm going through 30 years with great dispatch here. I left the music industry, went back to school, started to work in the capital markets, Wall Street private bank in the hedge fund space for about 7 years, and went from right brain to left brain. And it was in an industry that really has no connectivity, I thought. So one day working at the private bank, an individual came in and told me he was writing a book. And I said, let me take a look at it. And I took a look at it. I saw his first chapter and I rewrote his first chapter. And he said, boy, that's interesting. He sent it to Wiley, who's his publisher. And Wiley said, who actually rewrote the first chapter? He said, well, the guy that's managing my money at this bank. He said, okay. So Wiley sent back the book, all chapters. They sent me a check for $12,000. I'll never forget it. And said, rewrite each chapter. I think it was 12 chapters. They sent me $1,000 a chapter. This was 15 years ago. And so I rewrote the chapter and as a ghost, a non-credited, person as far as the creative side. And it became their best-selling business book. And so from that, I actually left the capital markets, left the financial industry, went into my own firm, which I have now. And with the knowledge of story from the entertainment industry, with the knowledge of finance and business, started my own company and started writing for authors who needed a compelling story to cut through a congested market. I will say this, what I found, and please cut me off at any time, Brian, you got me going now.
No, you just keep going.
Matt and I, with the jaws open, loving the conversation.
What I found was an intangible asset from my original years in the entertainment industry. What do I mean by that? When you're a composer, when you're a songwriter, you are essentially taking, let's say, a romantic song. You're taking a 20 to 30 year relationship, and you have to truncate this down to a 2 to 3 minute song. But you must imply and infer all that happened in the relationship, the love, the breakup, the romance, possibly the redemption. And you must do this in that amount of time. And so that places you in the practice of word selection, melodic structure, how to imply without having to explain everything that went on. So someone in a relationship can resonate with your relationship and fill in the gaps. Ain't it sad to belong to someone else when the right one comes along? So when you actually write songs, when you compose, what you're really doing is you're writing a short book. And when I made that connection and started writing books and transferred that to allow the book to represent a long song, there was a melody. I don't mean poetry. I'm not speaking about that type of prose. I'm speaking about when your approach, when you're thinking properly about how to disallow your reader from disengaging. My years of writing songs really helped me when I started writing books because I understood the short nature of the listener's attention. I understood how antagonistic a listener is because we knew that in the music industry, you have to hit it and hit it right away. So I started to take that approach to songs. And what I found is that if you're writing songs amongst songwriters, it's difficult to cut through no matter how genius you are because you're all within the same pool of creativity, even though your angle may be different. However, when you move into a different industry where your perspective has no antibody against it, because no one there comes from where you come from, immediately you shoot to the top of that particular industry because your sound, your approach is so different. What do I mean by that? So if an architect all of a sudden became a classical composer, his sound would cut through the industry all of a sudden, because people in the industry are writing notes. He gets to the paper and he writes buildings. And so his sound immediately cuts through. And the reverse is also true. If a songwriter all of a sudden became an architect, he would have a melodic sky. Isn't that beautiful? Look at it. I've never seen anything like that, because his angle of expression, there is no antibody in that industry against it, because they've never seen this creative virus. And so that is what happened to me in the book writing industry. When I approached it as a composer, my approach to the paper, to the written word, was much different. And so from childhood, from 8-year-olds in that church, from growing up, from basically directing all the music in my father's church, from being heavily involved in ministry and studying the great communicators of our age, whether they be political or religious or whatever, antagonistic, agnostic, just great communicators. And then going into the music industry and working in that space, and then going into finance and the capital markets, it created a cocktail perspective that allowed me to move into a ghostwriting story design space that is unique. There is no curriculum that leads you to being a ghostwriter. It is almost a blessing by mistake, because you have to have experiences from so many areas of life in order to take people from so many areas of life and understand the correct perspective to express their book versus forcing them into your limited exposure of your life. So you have to, so being in finance, being in entertainment, being in ministry, being involved in athletics, all of these different things allow you to essentially become like water and just take the shape of the person you're working with. And so that was my elongated version of how I got into storytelling. It was essentially a beautiful mistake.
What a beautiful mistake. I think that was amazing. One of the best intros we've ever had.
It really, I mean, I could have just sat for like 30 minutes and just kept listening to the more detailed version. By the way, for our younger listeners, and I know that there's a number of them out there, if, there was a ton of artists there, but if you have not listened to Boyz II Men, because it not only, one, I mean, the harmonies in my lifetime, were second to none, but the stories, and I not knowing, which songs you were involved in, but all of them all of them felt like a mini movie. Like it was like the entire, like you would get so tied to the words and the story that they were telling. So if for our younger listeners, do yourself a favor, go pick up, a couple of their albums and just listen through start to finish, because I'm sure that was an incredible experience. But it is fascinating how I love hearing how your people's careers evolved, Dennis, and just how one thing led you to another, where 20 years ago you never would have guessed that you were here, but all along you were building the skill sets. Like, we don't want to get too deep, but you talked about your time with your dad as a pastor, right? But it's amazing when you look back and go, there was a bigger plan, and we always all seem worried about whether or not things are going to happen in the right order. And your story is a great example of just sitting back and going, it's happening in the exact order it should, right? I mean, there's a calming effect when you know that.
It is a very calming effect, and I love your comments on the spirit behind them. It is, success it's tricky. It's tricky because, and I know that's not the greatest literary term to use, but it really is, because it looks so much like failure. And it's very difficult to really distinguish the two, because right when you're in the middle of doing something that you think is mundane, going nowhere, you have no idea that those are the same tools, the same skills you're learning for the biggest move of your life. And so, I always I have a sign on my desk that says plans don't work, but mistakes do. And I really, really believe that, because I thought my life was going in a different direction, logical direction. And it was only when it was placed on a different path that the skills I learned to do something else had the greatest value. It is the reason why, I have several attorneys in my family, and I noticed that, yeah, attorneys practice law, but many very successful attorneys, they don't practice law. It is just the basis of the law that allows them to understand everything else, And I think it's very much like that in as far as what you were saying, not knowing where you're going and whether, you're on the right path or not. The only thing I can say is you have to really be an acute observer of what is happening around you when it comes to storytelling, because growing up in the church and hearing the stories that are told within the framework of those who have a Christian worldview, if you listen to why do you believe this is true? If you just step back from it and just take your faith off the table and just say, what, have you ever really thought about the lunacy of what you're saying actually happened? And that you believe it? And, I happen to be one who believes it, but I'm able to step away as a storyteller and understand everything I was told in church. These are all stories. They're stories by individuals who understood the psychological construct of the unfaithful and what you have to create almost a Marvel and Pixar-like imagination to say this happened and this altar burned up and the sky opened and what happened next? And it is a very interesting, but when it's poured into you as a child, you grow up saying, oh, this is just the way it is. But very seldom do you understand as an adult that the same thing that got you to believe what you believed as a child is necessary for you to get the stranger to believe in your company as an adult. It is the same form of detailed, well thought out storytelling that is not necessarily connected to logic, because that stretches the muscle of belief even further. Mm-hmm. One of the problems with storytelling is when you use logic as a base, where you must instead use emotion and gut, not the emotions of crying and the emotions of laughter, and not that type of emotion, but the emotion of understanding and resonance, which we are so infrequently understood that when we're understood, that may cause us to cry. But the story itself may not be emotional. It is the emotion that comes and births out of understanding. You actually get me? You understand what I'm going through, man? That's so when you're telling a story, you have to use the same things that cause you to believe in what you believed as a child, whether it be the choo-choo train that could, or that thought it could, or the Three Little Pigs, or whatever else. We may laugh at these things, but these are bite-sized genius vignettes that allow us to essentially never forget them. And it's the same thing that you have to put in play when you're creating a story for your business or your personal life or your manuscript. It doesn't change.
I think it's absolutely fascinating. One of the reasons that I follow you so closely, because you articulate that storytelling so well, what it means to actually be a storyteller. Matt and I are in a space where we talk a lot about brands and building travel. And essentially what we actually do is build stories. We're in the vacation rental space, and everybody that's in this space understands that Airbnb has done a really good job, whether people like it or not, of building stories about destinations, about homes. And what we've done as professionals is we've taken that and we've turned it into a business, but we haven't actually understood the storytelling side of it really well, because it's a complicated story, right? It's not easy to distribute it to platforms, one, and then to your guest, two. And so, one of the things that I'd love to learn from you, and maybe give our audience a little bit of insight, is where do you begin with the thought process of building a story for your company? Because it's not easy.
Right. It is not easy. And I'm so glad you asked that question. It is asked often. And so when you're talking about building a story, there is not one approach, but let's go over a few of them. First, you have to take off the table that you're trying to build binoculars. That is, bring something that's far close. And how does that translate in stories? For a company that's unknown, has all this wonderful technology and wonderful functionality, and no one knows about it. And so they want to bring it close. So they create marketing, a story that is centered around what we do. This is who we are. We're the best, we're the cheapest. That's the binocular approach. You don't know us, we're far away, and we're going to put it right in your face. That's ineffective in today's, where we have just entered the age of meaningful work after the pandemic. And so in the age of meaningful work, that is ineffective. Better it is to create, when it comes down to your question, where do you start, is to create a mirror. And so when you start to tell your story, you want to start with, let us erect a mirror so the customer sees themselves. Now that alone is going to change your language. It's not going to be commercially narcissistic. It's going to be reflective. So you're going to find out more about your customer and their desires, and you're going to create a campaign, a story that reflects them. So when they look into this box of detergent, when they look into this tomato sauce, when they look into this, they don't see my company. I've created a platform for them to see themselves. Let me back up, because that assumes, so that's a story approach. That is a story, that's a mechanic of story building, what we call story engineering. But the first thing, that's really number two, the first thing I ask when I'm going to consult a company is this: what is a story? Before we build one, tell me what it is. And you would be shocked how much silence enters the room. Because people say, well, it's talking about what happened, or it is a certain amount of events. So you'd be shocked how that simple question causes the smartest minds, because they know their story and they've been in the presence of great stories, but they've never been asked to tell the purest definition of a story that has nothing to do with them. The reality is, a story is organizing and sharing the emotive consequences of life's events. That's an academic expression. Here's the pedestrian. A story is what happened because of what happened. That's it. If someone says a story is what happened, that's journalism, which is the reason why many stories sound like a news report. We're located in Colorado. We're the best this. They tell you how much they charge, who owns it, our owner, playing for the Rockies. I mean, they give you the list and they say that's our story because that's what happened. Not understanding the definition of story, the purest definition, the most effective definition is what happened because of what happened. I say it this way: if Tide is going to do a commercial showing my grandmother using Tide to wash my clothes is not the story. But a commercial showing me using Tide because it reminds me of my now past grandmother who used to use Tide. Now you're into story. Because now you're showing what happened because of what happened. I don't care if Tide is good or not. I don't care if Gain is better. That's not what grandmother used. Story connects the emotive consequence of an event. The event was my grandmother used it. The emotive consequences I do to remind me of her. And you can bring me detergent that is 10 times better. I will not touch it because grandma used Tide. That is what story is. So first, you have to sit down and say, let me explain what story is. Second, let's create a story that creates a mirror so a person can see themselves. And get this, mirror is used strategically. When you're looking in a mirror, you not only see yourself, you see what's behind you. Story adds validation. People want to sit down and put something together about the innovative nature of their content, of their product, their service. That's not what story does. Story adds meaning to what is behind you. It shows you yourself, and it gives words to wordless places. So now you can say, so what I was feeling when I was 10, that's what it's called. Story serves you. Story gives you words you didn't have. Story allows you to give meaning to that which you thought was meaningless. When you went through that sickness from the age of 10 to 17, what was that about? I missed everything. Story, when you're 30, 35, lets you know why you went through that and says, that is it. So story has a much larger function than just advertising your company, showing that we're the best, making the person cry who watches it. No, story should serve your emotional and intellectual existence with meaning you heretofore did not have until you heard the story. And here's the power of it. Story speaks to things that it doesn't speak to when it is created around mirroring, when it's created around understanding, when it's created around the emotive consequences of events. Then I apply it where I need it, that's why a great story is inspirational, because inspiration, as we explained it in my class, is a glass of water. People drink to the level of their thirst. Our job as storytellers is to pour the glass. People are going to take it the way they need it. So I can watch that commercial about that guy using type for his grandmother and apply it to somewhere else totally different than what you're talking about. Because great stories, great commercials don't just make you think about the product and service, it makes you think about the undefined areas of your life that needed explanation. That is why story is tangible and intangible at the same time, because it speaks to where you have landed. Does that make sense?
Yes. I'm taking your class.
Yeah, it does. And I think that's the tough part, because I think from a company standpoint, you're right. Because it was interesting. I'd never heard it described that way, but you're right. Most stories that you hear sound more like journalism. Let me tell you what happened, and I'm going to walk you. And even what I would say, most people haven't had the chance to hear probably great storytellers. When you do, you know it, right? But even the storytellers that a lot of us would consider good storytellers, I would say even there, it's still very like it's just that they tell you what happened in a little bit more of an enjoyable pace and things like that. But the great storytellers, you're right, it's not that way at all. And I think, Brian, as you think about travel, right, if any industry ought to be able to figure out how to tell stories, it's travel, because it is something that we do that is very emotion. I don't know. It's almost, it's almost as close to the need to, the need for security, the need for food. It's somehow it's right up there. And I think you saw it coming out of the pandemic. Things opened up, and what everyone did is they were like, I want to go experience, right? It was almost, I don't know.
Matt, it is inspirational, right? So to me, a story should inspire you to understand where, especially in travel, it's an inspirational time in your life. You are booking a vacation because you are taking your family or your significant other to go and build a story, essentially. And I think one of the things that we really don't focus on is building those stories around our destinations, our trips. We do it in a very journalistic way, but we don't do it as storytellers. And the reason I found this fascinating and listening to Dennis is because there is a need for us to actually understand why we're building travel companies. Why are we in the space? Why are we offering this home versus another home? Why is that home going to build that story for your family? In the example of Tide, staying, and we have this a lot, which is our travelers previous to like Airbnb, et cetera, we had a lot of repeat customers that were going to certain destinations. Why? Because they built a story to go back to those exact same destinations year over year with their families and build out, history. And that history helped them build the next trip. We just don't execute on that side well.
Dennis,
well, and
go ahead. Go ahead, please.
And you're not alone. Travel, wow. I mean, you are positioned such to tell some of the greatest stories on earth.
We are storytellers.
We should be.
Yeah.
We're just
That's exactly
We're just not very good. I'm feeling less. I knew we weren't good, and now I've listened to Dennis. I'm like, we were way worse than I thought we were.
I mean, here's the other thing about story as it relates to even your particular space. You have to feel comfortable not telling the whole story. You have to feel comfortable creating a platform for others to write the story. So remember, the genius of Steve Jobs, other than that, he took a piece of technology and created from it a cup of chicken noodle soup. Why do I say that? Because when you and I would have the flu as 18, 19-year-olds, what we would do, many of us would get in bed and want some chicken noodle soup. It was warming, it would make us feel better. They have lost market share because when we get in bed sick, we ask for our iPhone. It makes us feel like soup used to make us feel. Steve did not create a story. He did something that was even more powerful, was he created a platform for you to create yours. He could have called it the me phone, but he understood I is the most repeated word in human language. And so he called it the iPhone. And so when you think about it, Don Valentine, who was his first investor in 1974, the founder of Sequoia Capital, he passed a couple of years ago, a genius in picking companies in the tech space that were going to do well, from Dropbox to Apple to, you go to Sequoia Capital, you just be blown away with the companies he was behind. On YouTube, he's speaking to the Stanford School of Business, and without going through it all, he essentially is asked, how do you know what companies to pick? Because when everyone is smart, no one is. When everyone has pedigree, no one does. You're back to zero when everyone is a genius and has this great plan. He essentially says, I don't even care or look at any of that stuff. And he makes a genius statement somewhere around 24, 25 minutes on that video on YouTube. And he says, I pick my companies based on how well the founder can tell a story, because story is how the money flows. And he talks, this is the first investor in Apple who became a trillionaire, hyperbole, from that investment. And he said, Steve Jobs walked into my office, he needed a shower and his hair was wet and greasy, but I sensed a story from this company that was named after a fruit. So you're talking about the largest, most successful company on earth, and the person who gave it its financial fuel to go to the next level initially did so not because of technology, a microchip, the personal computer, all of that foolishness. That's journalism. He said, I sensed a story and made an investment based on it. So when you're thinking about travel, what are you trying to do? Many times we try to explain what travel is and what it does for our life, when the correct approach is going to be what we call emotional misdirection, which is to leave travel and create an emotive story that people then relate to. Oh, that's ABC company owned by Brian. That's what Google is doing now with Coda commercials. I'm a child of deaf adults, and he types in what he does to communicate with them. At the end, you start thinking about Google like Google is a charity, because you move away from what you do functionally. You move away from the services you provide, and you create a story about real life. Right after the pandemics, I'm still on travel because I'm thinking about what you're saying. You said it's like food. Right after the pandemic, or towards the end of it, I remember seeing a commercial, and I wasn't involved with this one, and I don't know who was, but he or she did a great job. A woman was on TV with a British accent advertising the food they sell, and they were showing great shots of their pies and their cakes and lasagnas and whatnot. And at the end of the commercial, and it gives me chills, I as a storyteller, I knew exactly what they were doing. At the end of the commercial, this is at the height, this is like when all hell was breaking loose in the world. She said, our food makes you feel like everything's gonna be okay. And I said, she got it. She spoke to everything without saying anything. Now I'm not thinking about the cake, the pie. I'm thinking everyone in this world is saying, is everything going to be okay? Are my family members going to be okay? And she leveraged that without leveraging it too much, because you can overstory story. And she just talked about the food and said, our food makes you feel like everything's going to be okay. So if you think about it, how in travel, how in that hospitality space can narrative be leveraged such that you respect the times we're living in, you acknowledge the times we're living in, you create an emotive story that does not depend on a house is not a home and all that tired, those are tired cliches of, or make a great story with your family and go in a totally different direction that people associate the emotional feeling they have from watching it with your company versus your company trying to take something that's unemotional, like a nice duvet, and try to make it some type of emotional presentation. So many times when you're thinking about your story, you have to leave your story, create a different story, and have that be associated with your service or your product versus trying to just dig and squeeze out of your product or service as much emotion as possible. It's called emotional misdirection. You totally leave it behind, establish something else, and that person will drag it to touch the thing you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions we've got, Des, is you used a phrase earlier, which I thought was really, we've reached the age of meaningful work, right? I also think that, and there's no question that that's true. I read an article the other day, just, about what this next generation is really looking for. And I think the financial returns of their work was maybe made number 3. I'm not even sure it was in the top 3, right? And there, but I feel like that's across all aspects of our life. Meaningful travel, it's and that doesn't mean it has to be all travel is, I want to go to Paris and study the architecture. Meaningful travel sometimes is I'm going to go sit on a beach, but I'm going to do it with those closest to me, right? It's about bringing families together and things like that. I think people are just being more meaningful about everything they're doing in their life. And I think some of that comes from just the realization that we're all here for a limited time. And, that's the one thing you're not going to get away from, right?
So Matthew, to that point, if I was writing copy for your company, it would say, life is far more unpredictable than it is short. Travel now. Now, I'm acknowledging, because remember, something is similar to pairing the unpaired. Life is short, life is short, life is short. It's actually more unpredictable than it is short. Mm-hmm. So it's not the time necessarily, it is what can happen within that time.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. You're right.
And so I'm not to step on you.
No, please.
If you were creating something for a copy, now copy is one version and then story is another whole thing. But if you were talking about your company and you were speaking about how to elevate travel to the place to acknowledge the age of meaningful work we've entered in and how people are willing to leave a job without having another one. We've never had a society like that before. We've never had a society that said, you know what, I'm here on borrowed time. I'm definitely not going to go back to a place where I'm hated and I hate. I don't know what I'm doing next. I'll sell pretzels until then. People are okay with that. The mindset has the tectonic plates of society have shifted, never to replace to their original spot. So when you think about travel, if I owned a travel company, I would highlight the unpredictability of life, not necessarily the short nature of life.
Well, and you brought up a good thing too there, though, that I think companies, when they think about storytelling, it's amazing. Brian and I immediately went to, okay, how do we tell the story to our consumers? I think some companies better figure out how they're telling the story to their employees. Mm-hmm. If you want to attract these really bright minds that are coming up that are going to develop the next, whatever it is that's going to propel your company forward, you better figure out how to tell them a story. My dad, I don't know how many listeners know this. My dad was an NFL coach for 22, 23 years. And before that was a college coach, but he was really successful in college, partially because he was a great recruiter. And actually, probably the one coach that was even a better recruiter than my dad, who my dad gave his first job to, was Urban Meyer. And Urban Meyer was kind of I can't remember what they called Jerry Maguire in his movie. It was like king of the living room, but that was Urban. I mean, like even from the very beginning. But Urban was a great story. So he'd go into these, he'd talk to these 18-year-old kids about coming to, Florida or wherever it was. And you're going up against Nick Saban. You're going up against, the list goes on, and you're trying to win these kids. But it's the same in corporate America. In fact, I've reached out to some of these coaches to try to pick their brains on recruiting. But, Dennis, I think the story's also really powerful internally, right? Just as in mobilizing a team behind something.
Yeah, but so right.
We've talked about this. The story comes from your staff, from your team. But it also starts from leadership. Your leaders have to know your story and understand your story to be able to deliver it to the rest of the team so that they can then deliver the story.
Yep.
Yeah, and
it starts at the top.
I totally agree. You have, the only thing that matches or surpasses the story we create to tell our consumers, our clients, our fans, which is, we didn't really get into that, but is the story we tell ourselves. That actually has greater impact. The story we tell ourselves, the story we tell our employees, our partners who work with us. I'm just thinking about a phrase that I don't want to forget. Never underestimate the frequency of rare events. I just had to say that. So when you think about the story you tell your employees, you have to, it's no longer, we're going to pay you this, we're going to pay you that, because meaningful work is at the forefront. People want to do something that matters, man. People are not in the place of saying, can I make $3 more by working over here? They want to, and everyone has to sustain their life. We get it. But humanity has shifted after we saw all those millions and millions of body bags. People who had wonderful 401ks and were 2 years away from retirement and who had just built their vacation home, who will never move into it. And so when you're thinking about what is going to cause someone to get up, leave their family, and come to work each day, that needs to be a great story. And it needs to be a true story. And it needs to be one that is a mirror of who they want to be, not a binocular into the future of the owner to build up who and what the owner wants to build for themselves and their family. We have to create a story that allows a person to see themselves, which in many ways is vulnerable, because then we have to almost ask that person, not here's your job description, but what job description do you want to have? That's a whole different beast because now I have a mirror. Well, this is what I would like to do. So the job market is shifting from this is what I want you to do to sitting down and asking people, what is the thing you want to do? And how can I facilitate that so you're able to do it and my company is actually able to grow and profit from you doing what you want, not what we have put on paper to hire somebody to do for us.
People. Brian, we've talked about this. I think you bring up a good point. If your people have the story, now it's not one person trying to tell the story. And more, I think people are, Dennis said, authentic. It's amazing to me. You can hire the biggest, baddest advertising agencies. And I don't know if it's the number of ads now we're served, but society's ability to see through the BS and go, nope, not buying it. That's not who you guys are, is unbelievable. And so they're associating themselves with companies that have their core values. But here's the thing. I think a lot of companies, they misjudge their ability to convince people what their core values are. And people are kind of calling them out going, yep, no, not buying that. Like, I don't think that's really who you guys are.
You know why? Because it's not authentic.
Exactly. But it's amazing how people can see through that, because there's really good ad agencies out there being paid a lot of money trying to convince people that, and look, I'm not saying everybody's trying to pull the wool over there, but people are realizing I've got to position myself with align with people's values. And I think some of those companies aren't really aligned with their values. They're trying to be unauthentic, but they think they can spin it or show it in a way, and people are seeing through it. So you might as well just say, look, let's show them who we are. Let's open up the kimono, right? And go.
So exactly. Show them who you are, and people will run to you when you show them what you don't have, what you can't do, but they know you're disciplined, you're dedicated, you're trying as hard as you can. This just world has changed. So I'm sitting at a charity event that helps young men from the inner city try to further their education, get them not to drop out of school, get them not to get involved with drugs and whatnot. Young men who are in under-resourced communities who just don't really have a chance. I mean, it was a kind of and we were in Orlando, Florida. The event was in Orlando, Florida. Long story short, it was a young man who wanted to go to college, got his GED. And so he stood up, and it was a time for him to just kind of tell who he was. And he was going to read a verse because it was a religious organization that was there. He was going to read a verse, and he was 18 years old. So the gentleman gets up, and tall, nice, handsome guy, looks like an athlete. He opens his little Bible there, and he turns to Psalms 23, and he was like, the Lord is my shepherd. Then he looked up and he said, I'm sorry, I just learned how to read. And he said, I'm sorry. One person stood up, started clapping. Another person stood up, started clapping. People stood up. They said, take your time. Take your time. We're with you. By the time it was over, 500-600 people were all on their feet, and he maketh me to lie down. We stood there for maybe a reading that should have taken 30 seconds. It took probably 6 or 7 minutes. Everyone was patient. We were cheering him on. We were helping him say the words. After he finished, within 5 minutes, they had raised all of the money for him to go to college. He's in college right now. He'll be graduating in a couple of years. Of course, he reads much better. He didn't try to fake and say, let me act like I'm so smart. He said, why don't I just be honest and say, I don't know how to read. And everybody said, we're going to support you. You're going to learn because this gives my life meaning. Where do you want to go to school? Done. He had his entire school plate. He's in school in Alabama. So why do I say that? You have to, in today's world, fake no longer works, man. You have to so what is the analogy of that gentleman who couldn't read? It is a company that doesn't have the resources to produce the product that's going to help the world. There's an analogy there. You may be able to read, but you may not have the financial backing to do what you need to do that's going to help a whole society. You may be able to read, but you don't have the education to push this, whatever it is. When you start your story from honesty, when you start your story from mirroring, because the reality is, while he was telling us he couldn't read, this is the wonderful thing about the story and how honesty can tell a story when you don't know how to tell one. I didn't think of myself not being able to read. I thought about the things I couldn't do. So him saying that allowed it to resonate with me. Wow, he's so honest about that. I didn't think about him. I thought about me. So now the meaningful part was that helping him was really helping myself. It's a very multidimensional, highly nuanced. Honesty does a whole lot. So if you don't know how to tell a story, if you don't know the mechanics of story, if you can't hire a person like myself to formulate your story, the best thing you can do is just be honest. And honesty will coach your story for you.
That's awesome,
man,
right there. That is awesome. Because you know what, all these companies, Brian, they all think they got to spend boatloads of money. And right there, Dennis is like, look, just start here and you'll get better, right? I mean, that's at least moving in the right direction. Sorry, Brian.
No, and I there's so many thoughts going through my head that go through the honest portion of it. It's having a passion. It's having a love for what you do. And I think there's so many combinations of that tell the true story. One of the things that I love about what Dennis does is that you can see he loves what he does.
Yeah. Yeah, you
It's
can't.
a
It comes through.
storyteller.
Yep.
It's genuine. And guys, every single one of his videos, it's inspirational. It is very truthful. It's to the point. So as we start to wrap up, Dennis, and thank you so much for taking the time. We usually do about half an hour, and
Yeah.
we've gone way over that, and
I know our team's gonna be like, "What, guys? Yeah, what are we doing?"
So, but we really do appreciate the time that you've taken to come onto the show and talk to our audience, and talk about storytelling, because it's really it's kind of a hidden secret. People don't understand it. They don't understand the power of storytelling. So, if you were to give one or two pieces of advice, and then tell us your favorite book that you've read recently, and then lastly, how do people contact you if they want to reach out and get some either advice or consulting or coaching from you? How do they do that?
Yes, if there's one piece of advice about storytelling, I would say, don't talk about what happened. Talk about what happened because of what happened. And that will place you on the right path, because you'll stop talking about yourself and what you do. You'll talk about the emotional consequences of certain events. And that is where you will attach to the heart of the listener when you talk about the emotional consequences of life's events, not just life's events, number one. Number two, favorite book I'm reading right now is Happy Go Lucky by David Sedaris. And I would suggest you pick up that book from a storytelling standpoint. He goes through so many things of his life, David Sedaris being one who used to clean homes and used to clean apartments as a maid in Manhattan, and was a part-time elf at Macy's. That created how he saw life, cleaning homes and being an elf, looking through those tiny eyes at people who have much more than him. Then he, coming from a pretty well-to-do family, but not really participating in that because his lifestyle choices, his father somewhat abandoned him. And I don't want to go too much into the story, but the book, Happy Go Lucky by David Sedaris, will give you an insight into great storytelling and allow you to look at your life in the same manner. I can be reached on LinkedIn, Dennis Ross, DennisRoss. You'll see me there. I have on a cowboy hat. One of my pictures, you'll see me. I have several videos there. My website is bookambitio.com, BOOKAMBITION.com. I don't do much on IG. I'm not really an IG person. I have it on there. I don't do much. But if you want to reach me by email, you can send it to my corporate email. It comes right to me. That's info, INFO, at bookambitio.com. And we teach, in fact, we hold cohorts, storytelling cohorts online. The one we're doing at the end of July is called How to Build a Story. We go into granular detail about everything we talked about today. We actually take the person's company in our cohort, which is a week long from Monday to Friday, and we build the story right there live. So it's a very, very, it's an advantageous class, because you don't just come to listen, you come to get done what you're hoping you can do when you leave. Well, we do it right there. So we build it and we give you options for the story. So you can find out more about that by connecting with me on LinkedIn, and I can provide more information.
That's awesome. I please, I encourage people, reach out. And I think there's a lot of different ways that Dennis can help, and just following him on LinkedIn is a big start. Dennis, thank you so much. Really, really do appreciate the time today. It's a fascinating topic. And, I was just thinking to myself, when you were talking, Brian was kind of talking about this lost art, and I'm like, it goes all the way back to when they were, on stone tablets, right? Or before words, where they would still, but they always told stories to pass down information and, important things to the next generation. Like, it was a way of communicating even before we had written word.
And Matthew, not to open this back up again, but you make a great point, because think about it, a story is really the highest form of technology. Technology was designed to make efficient those things that were more elongated in their processes, communicating across the world, now through phone, now computer, then email. Well, story is the most efficient form of telling you everything I've learned in my entire life and planting it in your spirit. And then you're able to give it to your children, your children's children. Story is technology, because without being able to live where I am, I in one story can transmit it all to you. It is the emotional email.
That's awesome. It really is.
Awesome.
Yeah. We may have to do, I'd love to do maybe another one in a few months, like get back on. Cause I'd love to, I think we could talk for a while about too, the impact, good or bad, or, what have you, but that the speed of communication and what impact that's had on, not only storytelling, but just if you still have to tell great stories, but has it then changed the way you've got to structure that story, right? And, I don't know how many letters or whatever you get on Twitter or what, so like within those confines of the new way of communicating, but excellent, and really appreciate it, Dennis. And thank you again.
Thank you. You all have a wonderful day.
You as well. That's it for this week's episode of GuestX. Be sure to sign up for our email list at guestxpodcast.com. That's guest, the letter X, podcast.com, and follow us on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a single episode. We are Mr. Guest Experience Brian Hamaui and Matthew Loney signing off and reminding you to always create a customer experience worth talking about.
This podcast is a Hospitality.fm production.